Please ensure that all electronic devices are turned off or switched to silent mode. This morning we will begin line-by-line consideration of the bill. The selection and grouping list for today's sitting is available in the room and on the parliamentary website. This shows how the clauses, schedules and selected amendments have been grouped together for debate. I remind members that a member who has put their name to the lead amendment in a group is called first, or in the case of a stand-part debate, the Minister will be called to speak first. Other members are then free to indicate they wish to speak in the current debate by bobbing or catching my eye. At the end of a debate on a group of amendments or new clauses, I shall call the member who moved the lead amendment or new clause again. Before they sit down, they will need to indicate if they wish to withdraw the amendment or seek a decision. If any member wishes to press any other amendments in a group to a vote, and this includes grouped new clauses, they need to let me know. The order of decisions follows the order in which amendments appear in the amendment paper. Any decisions on the new clauses will be taken at the end of proceedings on the bill. After decisions have been taken, all amendments and clauses of the bill. I shall use my discretion to decide whether to allow a separate stand-part debate on individual clauses and schedules, following debates on relevant amendments. I hope that's helpful. If any member wishes to make a declaration of interest, they can do that after I finish speaking. There's one more point that's not in my script, that there are 3 members of the committee with hearing impairments, so it would be helpful if members articulated as clearly as they could to help those members of the committee. Are there any declarations of interests? Chris Willis.
Thank you, Chair. Just to declare an interest, my father-in-law is a professor of cybersecurity at the City University of London, and also I've got a large data centre, Cal Data, in my constituency of Harlow.
Thank you. We start with Group 1 and the question that Clause 1 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Clause 2. The question is that Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Minister, would you be good enough?
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. This bill makes crucial updates and builds on the NIS regulations, which are the UK's only cross-sector cyber security regulations. As Clause 1 sets out, by NIS regulations I refer to the Network and Information Systems Regulations 2018, which were introduced by Statutory Instrument 2018-506. Clause 2 of the bill gives an overview of the bill's parts and what is included in them. As Clause 2 sets out, Part 2 of the bill amends the NIS regulations. It does this by expanding the scope of the regulations to cover data centres, large load controllers and managed service providers. It also introduces powers for regulators to designate suppliers as being critical for their sector. Part 2 also updates the existing incident reporting regime and includes provisions relating to the recovery of regulators' costs, information gathering and sharing powers, and enforcement powers. Part 3 of the bill gives new powers to the Secretary of State to specify other sectors as being in scope of the regulations in the future, to create new regulations relating to the security and resilience of regulated services, and to issue a code of practice and a statement of strategic priorities. It also requires the Secretary of State to report on this legislation and its implementation. Finally, Part 4 gives new national security powers for the Secretary of State to issue directions. I propose that these clauses stand part of the bill.
Dr. Ben Spencer, on behalf of the opposition.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Stringer. I'd like to start off by thanking all honourable members on both sides of the committee for taking part, as well as the officials for the work into this committee stage of this important bill. The bill significantly updates and expands the Network and Information Systems Regulations 2018 by bringing new services within scope of the regulation, giving sector regulators the power to designate critical suppliers, updating and expanding the reporting regime for cybersecurity incidents, and making significant changes to the regulatory funding model and regulators' information gathering and sharing powers. The bill also grants extensive powers to the Secretary of State to respond to emerging cyber threats. These include the power to bring further sectors within scope of regulation, giving directions to regulated entities, and issuing a code of practice which sets out measures for compliance with duties under the NIS regulations. Recognising the increasing role of malicious cyber activity as a threat to our national security, Part 4 gives the Secretary of State far-reaching powers to issue directions to regulated entities for national security reasons. Mr. Chair, COVID turbocharged the digitisation of all aspects of the economy in our daily lives, bringing new opportunities, but at the same time heightening the exposure of digital systems to exploitation by malicious actors. This is something the previous government recognised in its post-implementation reviews of the NIS regulations and a subsequent series of consultations on proposals to improve the cyber resilience of entities that are most important to the UK economy. These consultations included a review of information security risks relating to outsourced IT provision, data centres, and organisations controlling large amounts of electrical load. The last government's work assessing these threats has informed the government's decision today to bring data centres, managed service providers, and large load controllers within scope of the NIS regulations. The bill has been welcomed by industry stakeholders as essential for bringing the cyber rules governing critical infrastructure in line with modern threats, economic realities, and technological developments, and for moving our cybersecurity regulatory framework into close alignment with international partners, easing cross-border operations for businesses providing services overseas. So, in some respects at least, the bill identifies the right problems. But crucially, it falls short of providing workable solutions. Embarking on our scrutiny of the bill, we should be acutely aware of the raft of digital legislation that businesses and regulators have been asked to grapple with in recent years. Many of these new regulations are necessary, but as lawmakers we should be conscious of the burden we are placing on industries, and particularly SMEs, which are the lifeblood of the UK economy and have fewer resources available to them to navigate complex layers of regulation. Therefore, it is incumbent on all of us to enact laws that are clear and capable of practical implementation. We know businesses...
Would the Honourable Friend give way on that point?
I'm very happy to give way to Honourable Friend.
Alison Griffiths.
Yeah, I thank my Honourable Friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that whilst we support the intent of this bill, the breadth of Clause 2, whilst it's doing a lot of framing work, it's not necessarily considering the extensive perimeter that's coming through and how the proportionality is going to be applied in practice. And I suggest that's something that the committee will want to keep in mind as we move through the detail.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Well, I thank her very much for her intervention, and I'm very much reminded of the evidence session that we had earlier this week, where expert after expert lined up to raise concerns around the scope of definition, while acknowledging the importance in a very fast-moving climate as the IT and digital sector is, and an appreciation why some things need to be left to secondary legislation, the problems around the amount of uncertainty that's coming for business, and the need for extensive the need for extensive consultation so that businesses can feed in and have some degree of influence over the regulations that they're going to find themselves having to abide by. I'm very happy to give way to the honourable member.
I thank John Jennifer for giving way, and his speech is very interesting, and I recognise the need, his desire to be constructive on this particular issue. Would he recognise that actually what this is about is a balance, isn't it? Because actually we do want to include some flexibility into the legislation because of the ever-changing threat that he's touched upon. And equally, when we talk about SMEs, we recognise the challenge that SMEs may face to comply with this legislation, but actually it's important that they do comply with data sharing legislations, because actually it will have an impact on their business if they don't as well.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank him very much for his intervention and the point about a balance. I think this is probably an area that we're going to come back, well, I'm fairly confident this is an area we're going to come back to quite a few times as we go through the line-by-line scrutiny of the bill, particularly in anticipation of Clause 12 in terms of designation of critical suppliers. Clearly, proportionate regulations need to be proportionate, but you sort of need to know exactly what the regulations are to be able to face that judgment. And I think it's fair to say that given that a lot of the detail is not in the face of the bill and left to second legislation, as has already been said by some of the experts we've heard, it's very difficult to scrutinise a piece of legislation, most of which isn't actually in the bill and is being left to future regulation, particularly when these definitions are going to be so critical for businesses having clarity as to whether they're going to fall under scope or not of them. And again, I think, I don't want to sort of go into too much Clause 12 now in this introductory position, but I think Clause 12 is really the exemplar in terms of how businesses which could fall under the remit of being designated a critical supplier, how they can know what they need to do. And in fact, the operator of an essential service knows what information it has to pass on or not to the regulator on businesses that may end up being regulated by them. And this would be really helpful if the Minister could perhaps comment, even at this introductory stage and at the end of this, this grouping, in terms of how he envisages that balance being played out in the bill, particularly that so much of it we can't actually see because it's not in the bill and it's down to secondary legislation. Anyway, I digress. I'll get back on topic of this introductory remarks, Mr. Chair. We know businesses struggle with legal uncertainty, as I've said, and the increased costs of regulatory burden. And yet a series and vague definitions and uncertainty, in fact, sorry, apologies, I've just already said what I'm about to say. We know sector regulators lack the resources, the teeth and sometimes even the will to carry out effective oversight and enforcement of existing cyber regulation. But uncertainty about which incidents should be reported as well will mean that the burden on regulated entities and regulators is dramatically increased. All the while, institutional barriers to effective oversight and enforcement remain. This draft legislation fails to give the legal certainty and proportionate framework that these businesses need. If we are to have widespread adoption and hardened cyber resilience across the sectors that are most critical to the economy and our society. But perhaps most critically and then most importantly, there is little point granting the Secretary of State extensive powers to make directions to regulated entities for national security purposes if the government remains willfully blind to the greatest threats to our national security. Again, in the last few weeks, reports have circulated that Chinese state affiliate group hacked the communications of top down-the-street officials between 21 and 24. And yet the vital organs of our state, central government departments and agencies carrying out the most critical functions, are left unprotected and unaccountable in terms of their cyber resilience under this bill. If we don't address these problems, we risk this bill becoming yet another bill of missed opportunities for this government. These are opportunities we can ill afford to miss if we are to safeguard our economy and our national security. Thank you.
Minister, care to reply?
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. And can I welcome some of the comments made by the opposition spokesperson on this particular question. He raises the question of both definition and public sector inclusion. I will very briefly address them. Mr. Springer, it is customary for opposition to oppose for the sake of opposition at times, and this is, I'm afraid, one of those times. I've only set out two clauses which simply tell us what the index is in the bill, and so that notwithstanding, to address those two particular points, I was delighted that in the witness sessions we had witness after witness appreciate the flexibility of this bill, to appreciate the fact that government prescribing activities or incident thresholds in the finest detail in a fixed primary piece of legislation is not the way that business and government and regulators ought to engage with themselves. I hope the opposition comes to appreciate that in due course. On the question of critical suppliers, we'll come to it, no doubt, but I thought that in response to some of the comments from the opposition on the day itself, I set out a very clear, precise set of tests and found no opposition to that claim, but I'm looking forward to hearing any original thoughts on that question. On the question of incident reporting, I was delighted that there was a witness who noticed that the extension of the definition of incident reporting to include incidents capable of having an impact was appropriate and exactly in the right place too. And on the question raised on public sector's inclusion, Mr. Stringer, we're here not to prescribe and wait for law to tell us what we ought to do in the public sector, but to instead move fast and fix things. And it is in that spirit that the bill focuses on essential services. I beg to move.
The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Clause 2 stand part of the bill, which has just been debated. The question is that Clause 2 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 2 and the question that Clause 3 stand part of the bill. The question is that Clause 3 stand part of the bill. Minister, if you would propose it.
Thank you, Chair. So Clause 3 makes important distinctions as to which organisations can be considered operators of essential services for the purposes of the NIS regulations and which organisations cannot be. It clarifies that a person, which in practice would be an organisation or business, can be an operator of an essential service regardless of whether or not that person is established in the UK, as long as they're providing essential services in the UK. This means that organisations established outside of the UK can be regulated under the NIS regulations. Clause 3 also makes clear that the NIS regulations do not apply to public electronic communications networks nor to public communications electronic services. These are telecoms operators who are regulated separately under the Communications Act 2003. These amendments avoid telecoms companies being subject to duplicate regulation. They also ensure that all essential services in the UK are protected, even if the company operating them is based in the UK. I propose that Clause 3 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this clause amends relevant sections of the NIS regulations, stipulating that operators of essential services are within scope of the regulation, whether or not they're operating an essential service in the UK, regardless of jurisdiction in which they're established. Providers, public communications networks, PECNs, or public electronic telecommunication services, PECSs, are excluded from being categorised as operators of essential services to avoid duplication with their sector-specific security regime, as I believe the Minister has just said. This is an important provision to ensure that entities providing essential services in the UK are compliant with domestic standards. Perhaps the most important aspect of this change is ensuring that serious cybersecurity risks appearing within the systems of those entities are reported to the UK authorities for action, which is of course vital for the NCSC to keep abreast of emerging risks and to be able to respond to them. Nevertheless, the complex maze of compliance with regulatory standards across jurisdictions is a growing challenge for businesses of all sizes and particularly SMEs. This is also a complicating factor facing UK companies when providing services abroad, again particularly in this digital domain. Could the Minister lay out what discussions he has had with industry representatives on easing the complexity of cross-border digital service provision to ensure that the UK is a competitive and attractive place to do business?
Minister?
Thank you, Chair. On the particular question of cross-border compliance and making sure we have a proportionate and effective regime, we've had a series of engagements at ministerial and official levels with Tech UK representatives of the industry body in question, with NCSC having convened a series of organisations, I think not least in the context of managed service providers, but much beyond it as well, and a pretty extensive period of consultation on that and every other matter in the bill as well. And on those fronts, I feel satisfied that the bill has struck a good balance between both ensuring proportionality of what businesses experience, but really critically, increasingly as supply chains in this context become cross-country, Chair, I feel it vital that the inclusion of bodies that may not be resident in the UK but provide essential services here are covered by the scope of the bill.
The question is that Clause 3 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 3 and Government Amendment 11 to Clause 4, with which it will be convenient to consider Government Amendment 12 and Clauses 4, 5 and 6. I call on the Minister to move Government Amendment 11. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And with your permission, I beg to move Government Amendments 11 and 12 that are tabled in my name. Clause 4 of the bill amends the NIS regulations by creating a new regulated sector, data infrastructure, and designating the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology and Ofcom as joint regulators. Mr. Stringer, we've received clear feedback from the data infrastructure sector expressing concerns that a dual regulator model could create unnecessary complexity and limit accountability. These amendments will remove the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology as a regulator, leaving Ofcom as the sole regulator. This will streamline the regulatory model for data infrastructure and resolve the concerns raised by stakeholders. Ofcom already has proven regulatory expertise and is well placed to oversee the new data infrastructure sector effectively. By adopting a single regulator for data infrastructure, these amendments will reduce administrative burden, simplify engagement and strengthen accountability. This will ensure a clearer, more effective regulatory framework for this rapidly growing sector. Clause 4 brings qualifying data centre services into the scope of the NIS regulations, recognising both their vital role in underpinning our economy and public services and the disruption to them can significantly impact productivity, service delivery and revenue. I'm very happy to give way.
Wait, I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way on that point. Clause 4 relies heavily on capacity as the trigger for regulation. And I understand why that's attractive, it's measurable. But capacity is not the same as criticality. And a high capacity facility used for redundancy can present less systemic risk than a smaller, highly concentrated one. So I'd simply like to put on record that the way this threshold is applied in practice will matter more than the number itself.
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for that point. It's a very thoughtful point indeed. And the one assurance I would provide to her is that the direct definition of data centres and scope here rely on capacity as a proxy for the independent essential nature of them. But where critical suppliers, including data centres, below the capacity threshold, but high on a criticality threshold, are suppliers to essential services, they would be covered in part by the critical suppliers framework in the bill as well. And so I take very much that point into account. Mr. Stringer, I was mentioning that Clause 4 brings qualifying data centre services into the scope of the NIS regulations, recognising their vital role for our economy, our public services, and the prospective impact of disruption. An attack on a data centre can have significant impacts beyond the facility itself. As they underpin digital services, I'm very happy to give way.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. What consideration has been given to the potential conflict between data centres' contractual obligations regarding customer confidentiality and mandatory rapid reporting? And what assurance can the Minister give us that data centres would ensure that this conflict does not impact their future business?
Minister.
Well, thank the Honourable Member for that point. And in the course of both engaging with firms, we have considered what the timeline for reporting ought to be. It is very critical that the initial notification requirement, which is a much lower requirement than the full notification requirement, that at least gives the NCSE and other enforcement authorities the ability to be able to counter national security and wider impact risks as well. I believe that to be proportionate in the specification in the bill, but it is, of course, a matter for implementation that we will keep a close eye on as well. As data centres underpin digital services across multiple sectors, disruption or compromise can cascade through essential services, businesses and public services. Incidents may also pose national security and economic risks given the concentration of sensitive and critical data. Bringing qualifying data centre services into scope of the NIS framework helps ensure these risks are managed proportionately and incidents are reported promptly. As per Government Amendments 11 and 12, we propose that Ofcom is the regulator. Medium and large third-party data centres and very large enterprise centres will be required to manage risks and report to Ofcom. Their thresholds have been carefully calibrated to capture data centres whose disruption could have the greatest impact while avoiding unnecessary burdens on smaller operators. This will strengthen the cybersecurity and resilience of data centres, aligned with international regulations, and introduce structured oversight, notification and incident reporting to strengthen national security and economic stability. I propose that Clause 4, as amended by Government Amendments 11 and 12, stands part of the bill.
Government Amendment 11 proposed to Clause 4 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Dr. Ben Spencer. Thank
you, Mr. Chair. Clause 4 amends the NIS regulations to bring data centres, meaning meeting certain thresholds within scope of the regs as operators of essential services. Now, as drafted, these data centres will be regulated by DESA and Ofcom. However, the amendments moved by the Minister proposed Ofcom will be sole regulator for the subsector, and I'd like to thank him for his explanation as to why he's pushing these amendments this morning. Given the oral evidence from Ofcom and other sector regulators earlier this week regarding the challenges of recruiting skilled cybersecurity staff to regulate effectively, what assessment has the Minister made of the additional regulatory burden on Ofcom of this decision and its capacity to secure adequate resources to meet it? Clause 5 extends the scope of the regulation to data centres operated by the government, with the exception of services provided by or on behalf of intelligence services handling classified information. Mr. Chair, data centre infrastructure is increasingly vital to UK society, economy and security. Data centres underpin nearly all aspects of our digital lives, from sending emails to booking GP appointments to ordering shopping online. Businesses of all sizes routinely process their workloads in the cloud, supported by data centres. And for these reasons, data centres were designated as critical national infrastructure, CNI, in 2024. The UK digital sector, which is heavily reliant on data centres, contributed over 7% of UK total GVA in mid-24, growing almost 3 times faster than the rest of the economy. Data centres are also critically important to the UK's ambition to become an AI superpower. Training artificial intelligence models relies on access to an abundance of processing capacity, compute located in secure data centres. In October last year, Amazon Web Services experienced a glitch in one of its US data centres. This set off a chain reaction which took down online services across the globe.
Will he give way?
Very happy to give way.
Thank you for giving way. On the topic of the growth of this industry, and with 78% of UK enterprises relying on cloud-based services, 96% of companies expected to use public cloud services, 35% of UK businesses outsourcing IT support, and as of last year, 63% of organisations planning to continue or increase their IT outsourcing over the next 12 months. Does the Shadow Minister agree with me that greater consideration, or certainly elaboration, needs to be provided on the vulnerability of the supply chain of very large load data centres?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
So I'm very grateful for his intervention, and he'll be aware the issue regarding not solely in terms of the bottleneck that we have in terms of supply of cloud computing, of which I sort of put data centres, I put compute more generally, I put access to large language models more broadly in our country, is something that is very much on my mind and we've been raising to the government. At the moment, is my understanding around 70% of government directly procured cloud services are coming from the 3 big US providers. I hear from SMEs, cloud providers in the UK, but in all fairness, I mean, not just SMEs, so not just cloud providers, SMEs of all different types, all the time about the challenge that they have when it comes to government procurement contracts to procure domestic UK company services which are being provided, whether that's central government or otherwise. We are setting ourselves into a very difficult situation from a resilience perspective if not only are we currently heavily reliant on US big tech, but also we're not doing the work that we need to do right now to support a burgeoning UK tech industry. I'm messing this a different time, and that's before we in the UK we have fantastic universities, we have fantastic businesses, we really are a centre of innovation, but I think the problem is that companies can really struggle in terms of taking the next step forward. Now, of course, government procurement isn't the most important thing in the be-all and end-all. In some, it depends on what sort of sector you're operating in, it might be. But we're certainly not focusing enough and supporting our SME sector. And it's really good and it's really strong and it's, it's the potential to go great. But we still haven't had a hyperscaler. Yeah? We haven't had the expansion of the UK digital tech sector, which I think, all things considered, given our background, given where we stand in terms of our academic and our business resources, we really should have been seeing going forwards. And I think it's a shame on all of us that the attitude I hear, and I can understand it, although I wish it was different, and it needs to be different, from UK SMEs is that you come to the UK to get started, but then when you want to make some money and go big, you go to the US. And this is not only in all that we do when it comes to supporting the economy, we need to have a business-friendly area, and this is critical for UK jobs, it's critical for UK resilience. But I think it's something we need to be very, very mindful of when it comes to the regulations that we're putting down in this bill, in the cyber security bill. Things as what looks like, as quite straightforward as the particular specific regulations to data centres. We have to bear in mind all the time that any regulation that we put on business, that we put on industry, is going to have a burden and it's going to have a chilling effect. Now, don't get me wrong, regulations are important when they're used proportionately, as the member opposite, the Balancing Act, as the member opposite was pointing out, and a lot of this bill is a balancing act, but we need to make sure that we get the balance right. Every regulation that we do is a harm. From the outset, it creates a burden on somebody else to do that. Now, the benefits can... I'm very happy to give way to member opposite.
I really appreciate the honourable member giving away. I was just kind of taken by your sense there that every regulation is a harm. I can't hear that and not intervene. Regulations do place burdens on businesses. That is absolutely a thing. We all understand that. But we can't afford to look at regulation as only being negative. He's making a very, very, very good point about SMEs and their access to markets and their access to funding. But actually, if SMEs want to grow and thrive in the UK, actually, they need access to data centres that they can have confidence in the security of. Part of what we're talking about in the introduction of this bill is ensuring that those SMEs can be confident about the regulatory environment that we have in the UK, providing that reassurance to them. And later on, when we're talking about large load carriers, actually SMEs rely on electricity, they rely on the power supply, and actually making sure that we've got correct regulations in place to give them the security that they know they can have confidence that that supply will always be there, comes back to that regulatory framework. So I'm not in any way trying to step away from him. He also spoke about the balance of regulation, and I think he's right on that. But I think to use a sentence like regulations are harm, I think steps too far from that balance, and we need to make sure that there is a good side to this as well in creating the business confidence to allow those SMEs to operate in an environment where they can have confidence in their access to data and their access to energy. Thank you.
I'd just like to make the point for future interventions should be short and to the point. If any honourable member wishes to catch my eye, they shouldn't have any difficulty in doing that, but it's important to keep the distinction between interventions and contributions to the debate. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank the honourable member opposite for his intervention. He will probably be aware, or maybe aware, so my background is in medicine. I used to be a doctor before I came to this place. And one of the skills and the challenges in medicine is that any medical intervention, apart from a small handful, always have a risk of harm or will have some side effects or harm to the patient. And it's always a balancing act in terms of the harm and the benefit that you do in the balance. So my bread and butter before I came to this place was balancing harms and risks for the best interest of the person in front of me. And I take that, while I've never been a business person, I've certainly never owned a data centre or sort of run a data centre. The approach that I take in terms of business burdens is to see things that government makes businesses do extra that they wouldn't necessarily normally do, that they see which is in their direct interests as, and I will expand my words a bit if this helps in terms of explaining the logic, as a prima facie harm. Okay, so the starting point up front is that it is an extra burden, it's a harm, but then benefits from other angles can outweigh that harm. Yeah? So it's getting business to do something which then any regulation is, of course, if businesses were doing it anyway, we wouldn't need regulations. Yeah? So it's an additional thing that asking business to do. Now, it might be that we've decided that overall for the sector, it's in the sector's best interests, and individual businesses can't obviously regulate the sector and change the sector themselves, or we've decided for the good of society, we think businesses should do this. I'm always a little bit careful to say the least, when we as politicians say that we know what's better for the business in terms of what the business is doing. Now, I do get the point, though, about how regulatory certainty in itself can be helpful, and overall the overall benefits to society and the business network of having that confidence that there are data centres which are secure and work, having that confidence that the large load controllers, which now we're going to talk about in a second, have that status of control. But I think particularly in a bill like this, and when we get to it, I mean, this bill is a full fat compendium of cross regulations and links. But when we get to the later chapters, I really feel for any business which is looking through this, which is finding themselves subject to these requirements, trying to work their way through in terms of that. So I think we have to keep on bearing in mind, all of us, and I'm sure that's shared across this committee room, all of us want our businesses to succeed, we want them to do well, we want a stable, flourishing infrastructure. I just think the starting point, and again, this goes back to my medical roots, primum non necessare, which often misinterpreted as first do no harm, is actually the main thing you should do, is do no harm. I think as a legislator, you should have quite a high threshold to get over before you start saying, well, actually, the solution to this is let's put another law, or let's create another regulation, or let's put another business on burden. I mean, one of the challenges that I have going into this bill and looking at when I was looking at when it was first published is why do we need it in the first place? Yeah, what's the starting point? And that's something that I've been exploring and thinking about as we've been going through preparing for this bill coming at committee stage. Why isn't our industry doing it itself and sorting it out? Why is it the fact that the minister's here today and bringing forward these regulations on business, and why is that necessary in the first place as opposed to business sorting it out? And I'm sure this is something again that we're going to come back to and explore in a lot more detail when we discuss some of the more high profile impacts, cybersecurity impacts, particularly on JLR and MMS. So I think the point he makes is very good, and I don't think this debate is settled in some ways. I'm sure we're going to come back to it quite a few times during the passing of this bill.
I think your crystal ball's good.
Well, I'm certainly going to come back to it a few times, if not other members, and invite the minister to come back to it a few times. I'm talking about, going back to the point I was making about the dependency on particular sectors. So I was saying about the impact that Amazon Web Services had in terms of our society and system later on this year. So this AWS outage was caused not by a cyber attack, interestingly enough, but it does demonstrate disruption to our lives and businesses that could occur in the event of such an attack. Now, the last government recognised the vital and growing importance of data centres to the UK economy and people's lives, as well as the risks of serious interruption to these services. And this led to a public consultation on enhancing the security and resilience of UK data infrastructure. We would therefore welcome that this vital element of our national infrastructure will be subject to cybersecurity regulation. But for cyber resilience and regulated data centres, for this to be robust, it's essential that there are high rates of industry compliance. The government stated in its impact assessment for this bill that there's an ongoing engagement with the data centre sector. Could the Minister lay out what feedback he's received on the sector's preparedness to meet the cyber resilience standards set by the NIS regulations? Likewise, in terms of ensuring effective regulation, Ofcom will have a dramatically increased role in terms of cybersecurity regulations when these provisions come into effect. In view of Ofcom's current regulatory workload and the challenges with recruitment, again, I mentioned earlier and highlighted in the evidence session this week, what ongoing engagement is the Minister having with Ofcom more broadly in terms of making sure that it's sufficiently resourced to meet its role? And just before I move on, to the Clause 6 and large load controllers. Again, I feel I do need to go back into the discussion about the proportionality and the purpose and need for these regulations in this bill. Because I think one of the biggest criticisms of the NIS regulations is that they haven't really been enforced. And I'm not saying that enforcement in itself is a marker of, or should I say, a rate of enforcement is a mark of efficacy or compliance. But it is curious, and it has been raised to me, that enforcement itself does indicate that NIS regulations really haven't had teeth, haven't really changed anything. And I think the worst of all worlds, so one bad world is that we have regulations which are completely disproportionate and provide a huge burden on the industry, which isn't necessary. But actually, I think in some ways the worst of all worlds, one of a way of looking at another problem perhaps that we need to deal with, or we need to think about, is that we could legislate, we can produce this wonderful Cybersecurity Act. We go away really, really happy as legislators. We've done the Cybersecurity Act, and hey-ho, it's all sorted, it's all finished. We can sleep on our beds about the cybersecurity of the UK. But if the companies can't follow it, or won't follow it, or don't have the resources to do it, then all we've done is just really waste our time. But worse, we've given ourselves a false sense of security, as opposed to delving into some of the real challenges and problems in this sector, which include overall education, include encouraging businesses to take this issue more seriously, including encouraging people to do cybersecurity essentials.
Would Honourable think of it? And just on the very good point that he's making, I would argue that this is also a case for improving board awareness and ensuring that through the enforcement of these regulations that boards are actually incentivised to take this seriously and to ensure that they are equipped to understand the commercial reality of cybersecurity on their businesses, and enforcement is a really important part of that.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank you for intervention, and this is something I know will come up as a debate as we go through the line by line in this bill. It is a curious thing that we are receiving, again, consistent feedback that some boards aren't taking the issue of cybersecurity seriously in terms of allocating resource to do it, especially in the light of the very high-profile cybersecurity attacks on business. I mean, from a personal perspective, obviously I'm all over this, it's my role as Shadow Minister, but I think it's completely insane for certainly larger companies not to...
Will he give way?
Of course, I have to give way, but to just finish my point, but not to really focus on cybersecurity and the challenges this can have to any business of all sizes. But I'm very mindful of very small businesses. This is particularly problematic in terms of actually the implementation.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Does he agree that the government really should be heeding the message from Chris Dimitriadis, the Chief Global Strategy Officer at the Information Systems Audit and Control Association? And he said the following: "The era when cyber regulation could focus solely on critical national infrastructure is over. Today, every major employer is a part of the digital economy and therefore part of the threat landscape." Surely the government should heed that message.
I thank him for his intervention, and I think it's a really stark message to give out, and it's one, going back to the point I was previously making. I mean, you also really struggle to think how many of the smaller businesses can really put in the resource that they need to take those sort of cybersecurity steps forwards. And there's a broader point here, which goes back to some of my opening remarks. A chunk of this is hostile state actors, which are attacking our companies, which are attacking Parliament, which are attacking the government, whether that's through directly or through their intermediaries. I mean, I found it quite ironic that it was announced earlier this week. I think that our security services are going to work with China's security services in terms of dealing with cybersecurity threats. I sort of feel, well, hang on a sec, what are they going to say, given that China and the Chinese Communist Party is one of the main drivers of our cybersecurity threats in the UK. This bill in this area is one of those, I think, a particular challenge when we're looking at legislating and how our society approaches it, given that it's not merely criminals, it's not really, hacktivists or whoever in terms of doing this stuff to our companies or institutions. It's also full fat hostile state interference, whether that's from Russia, Iran, or the Chinese Communist Party. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady and then...
Alison Griffiths.
Okay, in that case, give way to...
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. The risk and the threat from hostile states is plain to see. But does he have any sympathy with a proposal that I put forward a few months ago on the floor of the House of Commons in the form of a 10-minute rule bill, that to strike the balance between bureaucratic administration and the risk that that would pose to small businesses versus the very real risk that cyber attacks pose to the economy in general, the government should firstly have within scope the private sector, but secondly look at setting a threshold that does not become burdensome on smaller businesses. The proposal that I put forward was that any company that turns over perhaps £25 million or more is within scope in order not to bear down too heavily on small companies that would otherwise find the process and the risk and the burden of reporting too onerous.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank you for intervention and for the really interesting proposal that is put forward, which is an attempt to crack the nut of one of the problems which I think is subsumed within this bill. Because what this bill does is it sort of cherry picks some certain sectors which we've decided we need to have which need to be regulated entities, and there's a whole host of definitional things. Then it adds a sort of, the Secretary of State can sort of allocate some other bits that it sort of wants to tag on, whether that's through the secondary legislation or whether that's through the designation of a critical supplier. Then we have the MSP component. What it doesn't deal with is if you were sort of to speak to the man in the street and say, what is the biggest cybersecurity attack you've heard of in the past year or so? And if you can find someone who'd answer that question, it's going to be, it depends where they're living, to be fair. I mean, if it's in the West Midlands, which has had such a catastrophic effect on the local economy, they're going to be talking about, JLR. In other parts of the country, the focus might be more on Marks and Spencer, it might be more on Co-op. This bill doesn't fix that. So then the question is, well, if it's going to fix that, if there is something that needs to be done, what's the way of doing that? Is it through having something which is down to turnover, so it's not so onerous on other companies? Is it something in terms of supporting the insurance industry? This is something that the government really, I think, needs to... This bill is silent on this issue, and this is something that I think the government really needs to come up with some answers to, because I totally appreciate, what I do understand what the government's trying to do with this bill and how it's taken its forwards. Of course, the NIS regulations need updating. I do sort of appreciate that. But the big stuff, the one that's, the stuff that's really had a huge impact on people's lives, and also a massive bailout in terms of several billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, which has gone to try and resolve this issue. I mean, my question is, how many more JLRs can the government afford to bail out until it actually does something in terms of resolving this particular issue? Again, I suspect we'll come back to that later on in discussion, but it's such a good point, and I'm really glad to put forward his 10-minute rule bill, because we need to have a solution in terms of how we're solving this, but also at the same time not putting onerous burdens on companies who already are struggling, really, really struggling because of the taxation burdens which have been put on them and the anti-growth agenda that this government's been taking forwards by putting punitive taxes on companies to pay for its profligate spending. And I tell you what, and going back to the discussion in terms of prima facie harms, taxation, I think, is the best example of a prima facie harm, which is why you should be very happy to give way on taxation.
I thank the Honourable for giving way. I fear I'm about to repeat what I said a moment ago. Again, taxation is, nobody gets up in the morning and is excited to pay tax. I'm aware of this, but tax pays for our roads, it pays for infrastructure, it pays for our hospitals, which keeps our workforce in good health, it pays for the education of the next round of employees, our security services, the police, which help prevent crime, a whole variety of things which is essential for businesses to succeed. So again, taking an evangelical view that tax is bad is just not...
Order.
Thank you, Chair.
I will take the opportunity to remind the Honourable Member again, but I also remind the Shadow Minister and the Honourable Member that this bill is not power trap. It's relatively narrowly drawn, and I'd be grateful if Honourable Members could come back to the what's on the face of the Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I tell you what. So I tell Jane Rumble what. Let's, at risk of getting in trouble with the chair, I won't respond to the respond. But I would welcome the. I look forward to the opportunity of debating this again, perhaps in the emergency budget in the next couple of weeks. I'll move on to large load controllers, clause 6. So this is bringing large load controllers within the scope of NIS regulations, providing the flow of electricity in and out of the smart appliances if they manage it is above 300 megawatts. And I understand very much that this has been the threshold which has been decided through consultation in terms of the threshold of which could have a substantial impact on the grid. And the grid, as it stands, is really set up. And the challenges around managing the grid is around peak demand and supply and big changes in demand and supply. So I can entirely understand why the Minister and the Government is bringing forward this particular provision, given that if smart EV devices were taking out, and I have a smart charging EV device myself, in a system-wide could cause great big grid disruptions, particularly as we integrate different infrastructure into our homes, whether that's solar panels, whether that's batteries, and other energy-related smart devices. In fact, we need the grid going forwards over the next 10, 15 years, 20 years, to become more smart device integrated. When you look through projections in terms of energy consumption, we need the ability for people to be able to use the grid and have expansion of technologies such as vehicle-to-grid energy supply, so that we can manage peak load as part of expanding our energy in terms of reducing energy costs and supporting renewable energy and transition to net zero. So I can see that, if anything, this particular issue is going to be more important and more expansive over the years. On that basis, I do have some questions for the Minister on this particular clause. Why, a bit more generally, why is it that it's these two particular sectors, data centre and large load controllers, he's decided to bring on the face of this bill as opposed to other ones? And I said it in particular reference to the NIS2 regulations, where it's expanded a bit more. And how does he envisage, in particular, this area expanding in the future? I mean, is he confident that this clause on the face of the bill is sufficient in scope to cover the future technologies which are coming down the track? I'm thinking about EV app chargers, and the list is prescriptive. Does he have sufficient flexibility? Does he have the ability to come back at this with secondary legislation if he needs to expand it in the future, given that it's put on the face of the bill in this form? Would it be better not to put it on the bill like this and to use secondary legislation to lay it out to give that flexibility, given that he's been trying to keep such flexibility, understandably so? We can have a, let's not go back into the debate about that at this point, but just so I can understand a bit better his reasoning behind that. So I'm not, this certainly isn't a criticism from my perspective, it's just why is it in particular these have been pulled out as provisions as opposed to leaving to secondary legislation? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and with your permission, I will restrict my comments to the clauses in question, in particular clauses 5 and 6 and the relevant government amendments. Mr. Chair, the opposition Shadow Minister has auditioned for the role at DBT in talking about a philosophy of regulation, auditioned for the role at DHSC in talking about his medical background, and the role at the Treasury for taxation as well. I will try to restrict myself to none of those, but simply to the particular clauses and 3 points that I wanted to address in response to his comments. The first of those was related to skills and resourcing of our regulators. And on that, I welcome his both prior engagement with me directly and his questions now. Mr. Chair, I found very persuasively that the last government gutted our regulators out completely. In talking about either growth or regulatory quality, they achieved neither in having done so. And as a consequence, it is on us to be able to make sure that our regulators are fit for purpose and resourced in the way that they need to be. This bill gives them the powers of securing initial and full notifications in a timely way. It gives them the powers to share information in an appropriate way, and fundamentally it gives them the ability for cost recovery to resource themselves in an appropriate way as well. Alongside that, our wider initiatives on skills in the cyber sector and technology more broadly are fundamental in achieving our aspirations, not least through the Cyber First programme, as I mentioned in the witness session. I might just make a mild bit of progress. As I mentioned on the, in the session prior, that it reached 415,000 students. It has now been involved into a wider Tech First scheme as well. The Shadow Minister, as well as the Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, made a very important point about resilience in particular and sovereign capability. And I'm really proud in particular for those reasons of two things. One, that this bill includes now suppliers that may not be resident in the UK but provide essential services in the UK, a really critical means through which we can secure our capabilities here. But two, something close to my particular interests in the data centre and compute world, that through our initiatives on both sovereign AI and having launched a very innovative advanced market commitment in the chips part of the stack, which ends up crowding in wider demand, not least through companies like Nscale, a fundamental part of our AI growth zone in the North East. This government is finally rectifying the errors and omissions of the last in ensuring that Britain does not do what it did in the last commercial cloud context, but instead in this AI compute world has some actual chips on the table. Third, Mr. Chair, I won't try to settle the thrilling debate between the opposition minister and Shadow Minister and my honourable friend from Lichfield on the philosophy of regulation, but I will simply make a humble application that in this context we have found not a full-fat compendium, as the Shadow Minister described it, but a very targeted bill, which has been the result of extensive industry engagement, indeed some of it carried out by his own prior government, which aligned on the sectors in question and the inclusion of critical suppliers in scope. On his particular question of the thresholds and definitional specificity of large load controllers in the face of the bill here, I will of course remain very open to ensuring that the secondary powers intended precisely to be able to move flexibly as the clean power industry moves will be able to, will give us the flexibility to move with it. But at the same time, the threshold of 300 megawatts reflected the point at which a large load controller could pose an unacceptable risk to the electricity system and our CNI. This was a threshold set very clearly in partnership with technical experts, including the National Energy System Operator. And of course, as the market grows, the potential for cyber incidents will grow. We will keep it under close review. I'm happy to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Thank you, Chair. It's on the point really of flexibility. I think we would recognise that sometimes the legislative process in this House doesn't always move as quickly as we might want it to. And there's reasons for that, because scrutiny is really important. But would he agree with me with the changing nature of the cyber threats we face, but also the changing nature of technology, which he understands far more than me? And that's why it's so important to have flexibility in this bill.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. Can I thank my honourable friend for that point? The reality of it is that neither he nor I are likely placed to judge exactly where the thresholds should be set on a permanent basis, and that is exactly why we have secured the flexibilities that we have in the bill. If I might move to Clause 5 more generally, Clause 5, Mr. Stringer, brings Crown-operated data centres into scope of the regulations, NIS regulations, ensuring government data centres meet robust standards comparable with those in the private sector. Bringing Crown data centres within scope closes a critical gap and guarantees that public sector infrastructure is protected against evolving threats. Exemptions will only apply in defined cases where a data centre service is provided by an intelligence agency or a facility handling highly classified, secret or top secret information. These data centre services are already governed separately, and applying the NIS regime could cause conflict. I propose for that reason that Clause 5 stands part of the bill. I will turn finally to Clause 6, large load controllers focus clause, which introduces that essential new service of load control under the energy subsector of the NIS regulations. This will capture organisations remotely.
Order. I'm sorry to interrupt the Minister, but can you speak just a little more loudly for the benefit of those members? and slowly.
Loudly and slowly.
Yeah.
This will capture organisations remotely managing significant amounts of electrical load via energy-smart appliances, both in a domestic and non-domestic setting. These organisations play an increasingly important role in the management of the electricity system, but are not currently regulated for cybersecurity. A cyber attack could therefore create major disruptions to the national grid, shutting down public services and critical national infrastructure. Capturing load control as an essential service will safeguard the public from these disruptions. It will also reflect the need to bring in new safeguards to manage a more digitalised and dynamic energy landscape in the transition towards net zero. The load I'm happy to give way.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for giving ways. Just before he moves on, because I was a bit nervous that he was going to just finish up, I do have an additional question about the Crown data centre. What happens if a data centre is providing services both commercially to the public and to the Crown? How is that operated within the scope of this bill?
Minister.
I'm happy to write to the Shadow Minister on the point. My understanding is that a Crown data centre in scope will be in scope if it's providing in that particular example to both the public and the private sector. But I'm very happy to write to him and clarify the points that he's asked. Capturing load control as an essential service will safeguard the public from these disruptions. It will also reflect the need to bring in new safeguards to manage a more digitalised and dynamic energy landscape in the transition towards net zero. The load control market is growing exponentially, and we need to make it cyber secure. For that reason, I propose that Clause 6 stands part of the bill.
Government Amendment 11 proposed to Clause 4 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Government Amendment 12 to Clause 4, which has just been debated. Minister to move formally.
To move.
Government Amendment 12 proposed to Clause 4. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Clause 4, as amended, stand part of the bill, which has already been debated. With the leave of the committee, I will put a single question on Clause 4, 5 and 6, which have also already been debated, standing part of the bill. No objections. The question is that Clause 4 as amended and Clauses 5 and 6 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 4 and Government Amendment 13 to Clause 7, with which it will be convenient to consider Clause 7. I call on the Minister to move Government Amendment 13.
Thank you, Chair. I beg to move Government Amendment 13, which is tabled in my name. I will also talk to Clause 7 in my remarks, as you have suggested. Clause 7 amends the definitions of relevant digital services provided. I will refer to these as RDSPs in these debates and cloud computing service in the existing NIS regulations. As in the original NIS regulations, an RDSP is a cloud computing service, online search engine, or online marketplace. To be in scope, they must provide a service in the UK and not be a small or micro business. This prevents disproportionate business burden, focusing on those larger businesses whose compromise could have a significant impact on the UK's economy or society. Changes to the definition in this clause would clarify that in order to be in scope, they cannot be designated as a critical supplier or be subject to public authority oversight, defined by Clause 11. This maintains consistency with the approach to managed services and minimises dual regulation and unnecessary burden. Government Amendment 13 strengthens the definition of a cloud computing service in Clause 7 of the bill by introducing precise, clarified and separate definitions of the three core characteristics of cloud computing resources, which are scalable, elastic, and shareable.
Would the Minister give way on that
I'm
point?
very happy to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Clause 7 is definition heavy, and rightly so, and these terms decide who is regulated and who is not. But my only observation would be that cloud models, and indeed, as the Minister will know, the coming AI, the already come AI revolution means that they are evolving quickly, and so definitions that track architecture too closely will age fast. So the committee should be alert to whether these terms will still make sense in 5 years' time, not just today.
Minister.
I very much welcome that point by the Honourable Member, and I believe that in talking about the broad architecture characteristics rather than specifying the specific nature of it, the aspects of being able to scale compute, to be able to make it elastic to multi-tenants by making it shareable, we capture both commercial cloud and AI deployments as well. But of course, I would be keen ensuring that we keep it under review and, where possible, use the flexibilities provided by the bill to adapt it to changes in technology. Whilst the policy intention behind the definition has not changed, the amendment will provide certainty for industry to support effective regulatory oversight and to ensure that services whose disruption could significantly impact the UK economy and society are properly captured. In addition, the drafting is more aligned with our international partners, improving efficiency for providers operating across borders. This targeted technical improvement brings greater clarity, consistency and fairness to the NIS regulations. I urge members to support this clause, an important amendment.
Government Amendment 13 proposed to Clause 7 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. Clause 7 amends the definition of cloud services which have been within scope of regulations since the NIS regulations came into force. This expanded definition emphasises remote accessibility and the on-demand nature of cloud services, as well as that services may be delivered from multiple locations. It also excludes managed services from the scope of cloud services to avoid duplication of regulatory requirements and oversight. The Minister's proposed amendments to the provision in Government Amendment 13, which sets out further detail regarding the features of in-scope cloud service provision, including common access by multiple users, with each having access to separate processing functions. My question to the Minister is actually also building on the question that my honourable friend raised, which is obviously it's very difficult to predict, if at all possible, how the tech sector is going to evolve, but what powers would he have, or the government have in future, to adjust this as the cloud ecosystem changes, and what consultation has he done on that within the scope of this bill?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. And just on this point, an important point that the Honourable Member opposite had also raised, the changes to the definition came about in part through extensive engagement, and in particular by ensuring that the properties, the attributes of elastic and scalable were treated individually rather than just jointly, and that shareable, the precise ability to be able to have multi-tenants and therefore be a genuine cloud computing service for multiple clients, was considered in scope as well. As I've mentioned to the Honourable Member, it is very important that we keep it under review, and part of the reason for the secondary powers in the bill is precisely to be able to move to make sure that the bill remains both specific and giving clarity and certainty, but at the same time flexible.
David Chadwick.
Thank you, Chair. Currently, the law requires regulated persons to manage risks to the security of their systems. This amendment from the Liberal Democrats explicitly inserts risks arising from fraud into that duty. It makes clear that a system cannot be considered secure if it is easily exploited by scammers. Fraud should be considered as a national security issue, and there's quite clearly a relationship between fraud and cybersecurity. It's a fact that scammers across the world are targeting British citizens. Elderly fraud victims in Dyfed-Powys lose £7,900 a day to a tidal wave of scams. perpetrated by scammers from many countries across the world, notably Nigeria. If we look UK-wide, in the first half of 2025 alone, criminals stole over £600 million through scams. Surely we cannot pass a cybersecurity and resilience bill.
I think the honourable member is discussing the next group of amendments, the amendments to Clause 8 and Clause 8. We're discussing at the moment Amendment 13 to Clause 7.
8, 11 and 12
That's the next set.
that we're discussing now.
No, we're doing Amendment 13 to Clause 7 at the moment.
Okay, apologies for the preview.
Right, I should have caught you earlier when you started. Does the opposition spokesperson wish to speak?
I was just to help a colleague.
If
I think
the
he's
honourable member could start.
sorry, it was slightly more informally, Chair, just to help a colleague. I think the grouping selection of amendments has changed, so I think he may have the previous iteration, which I think is where that confusion is. Just wanted to help.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Had the Minister concluded his remarks on Amendment 13 and Clause 7?
Chair.
Thank you. Government Amendment 13 proposed to Clause 7 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Clause 7, as amended, stand part, which has just been debated. The question is that Clause 7, as amended, stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 5 and Amendment 25 to Clause 8, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendment 28 and Clause 8. I call on David Chadwick to move Amendment 25.
This is online fraud or local authorities? Fraud. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yes, surely we cannot pass a cybersecurity and resilience bill that ignores a crime that affects thousands of people. And we know that cybersecurity criminals from across the world do look to attack individuals to enable themselves to get into systems. Families are losing life savings and small businesses are shutting down because of this epidemic. The government often treats fraud as a policing issue, but this amendment establishes that it should be regarded as a cybersecurity issue that needs action at the national security level. By amending Regulation 12(1) of the NIS regulations, we place a legal duty on digital providers to identify these vulnerabilities proactively. And if we mandate that these providers manage fraud risks before an incident occurs, we will reduce the number of victims and the devastation caused to livelihoods. We cannot claim to protect our digital economy whilst ignoring billions lost to scams.
Amendment 25 to Clause 8, as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you. If I may, Chair, I'll also speak to Amendment 25 and my remarks to Clause 8 as well, which is saying, I'll start by speaking to Clause 8, which provides a new definition of relevant digital service, which makes clear that this category includes online marketplaces, online search engines, and cloud computing services. The definition of relevant digital service provider is updated to encompass all entities providing a relevant digital service in the UK, regardless of whether they're established here. Entities designated as critical suppliers are also excluded from the definition to avoid duplication of duties and regulatory oversight from sector-specific competent authorities. However, the definition excludes from scope of regulation relevant digital service providers subject to public authority oversight unless they derive over half their income from commercial activities. The exclusion of organisations overseen by public authorities also applies in relation to relevant managed service providers. In many respects, and this obviously links through to Clause 7, these clauses provide necessary updates to reflect the changing nature and use of vital digital services. But once again, including within the scope of regulation or companies established or headquartered elsewhere, but delivering services to the UK, helps to ensure those companies report cybersecurity incidents to UK authorities, rather than just authorities in their home states. So it means that UK regulators and law enforcement are equipped with the most comprehensive knowledge of emerging threats. However, we know from the findings of the National Audit Office's report on government cyber resilience last year that our public sector digital assets are among the weakest links in the UK's cyber security ecosystem. So why then have public sector controlled RDSPs and RMSPs been excluded from the scope of regulation? And I think this covers a sort of more general area of this bill, which is the exclusion of government and local authorities, the public authority services, in terms of being in scope within this bill. And I'll ask this question now to the Minister, but I think this also will come up again when we start talking about designation of critical suppliers, where there is quite a mix in terms of these critical suppliers being provided to public authorities who may or may not themselves be regulated, such as the NHS, which is, or public authorities such as local government, which isn't. And what's the situation where, for example, a regulated entity has a critical supplier for which the supply is coming from a non-regulated entity, but which is a local authority or otherwise? And I think this is particularly acute in social care. And I'd be great if the Minister could expand on that a bit more in regards to the public sector oversight. Coming to Amendment 25 in the name of the Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnor, this amends in this Regulations 2018 to include fraud as one of the risks to security of network and information systems relevant digital service providers must identify and manage. Many fraudulent sites, including those posing as legitimate government resources, often remain accessible by search engines, even after platforms have been alerted to the risk by service users. So this is the case where you've got a fraudulent site, it's been flagged to some sort of provider, and it still can be there and present even when this risk has been provided. Wherever online platforms or search engines can do more to protect users from fraud, they should be doing so. What analysis has the Minister made of this particular risk, and whether this bill is the appropriate vehicle for bringing in further measures to tackle this particular issue? If I have to give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Given the boundary lines between cyber attacks and financial crime blurring, I can see the compelling reasons why this amendment has been put forward. But does the Shadow Minister agree with me and acknowledge that fraud detection often requires a very different skill set to standard network security, and so it is important to strike the right balance?
Dr. Ben Spencer.
I thank him for his intervention, and I would agree broadly in terms of as I say that, and this is one of these hard areas where there an overlap in different areas. So I do have sympathy for the importance of raising fraud, at any opportunity, but particularly within the scope of this particular bill. It does remain to me, though, that I do remain concerned, though, that where a fraudulent entity is operating, and we focus on financial fraud, but that isn't necessarily limited in scope to financial fraud, especially when we think about other malicious operators with ransomware and hacktivism, and where these boundaries are particularly blurred. There is a particular issue which I would be very grateful for the Minister to respond to. It's in this situation where there is a fraudulent operator. That operator, that service, that provider is operating, that organisation has material, whether that's on social media or subject to search engines. The police or other competent authorities have flagged a provider that this is fraudulent, this is illegal criminal activity, and the duties on which for that provider to remove that and take that down as part of their own duties, and whether this is something that the Minister is aware of, whether he's looked into it, and what the government's plan is to crack down on this activity.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And with your permission, I might first address Amendment 25 and then the wider Clause 8 to Can I firstly thank the honourable gentleman, the member for Brecon, Radnor and Kintyre for this amendment to Clause 8, which amends the duties for RDSPs in the NIS regulations. I empathise with the source of his concern about fraud. It is something that I think many of us in the House know and feel through either personal experience or through that of our constituents. That said, the security duties within NIS require RDSPs to identify and take steps to manage the full spectrum of risks posed to the security of their systems. They must prevent and mitigate relevant incidents regardless of what these threats are or where they emanate from. This includes taking an all-hazards risk-based approach. Entities must manage risks to cybersecurity, physical security, and broader operational resilience. Security includes the ability to resist any action that may compromise the availability, authenticity, integrity, or confidentiality of those systems. Those include those risks that may arise from fraud. I would caution against highlighting only one particular vector of risk in this provision. This is unnecessary and does not reflect the full range of risks each RDSP faces. Further, whilst the bill clarifies the high-level duty to manage risks, secondary legislation will give further detail on the security and resilience requirements. Guidance and the Code of Practice will give further detail still on the types of risks to consider. I kindly ask that the honourable gentleman consider withdrawing the amendment for that reason. The Shadow Minister asked a particular question about the government's treatment of fraud, not least where fraud has been found on a platform and the authorities have asked a platform to take it down. The two comments I'd make: one, the government had made a very clear commitment for a new fraud strategy in the manifesto, and the Home Office, as the lead department, has been working at pace to engage deeply in making it an effective reality. Alongside that, I'm conscious that in my wider role in online safety, fraud is a very fundamental area of content that platforms have to look at, where it crosses the border of illegality, as it may well do in the instance that he describes. And that has been a central focus since the illegal content duties have come into play last year. I believe those sorts of instances are well covered by the pieces of legislation I just mentioned, and this piece is clearly much more focused on critical national infrastructure and its exposure through network and information systems.
Minister, would the Minister give way?
Happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister
Lincoln
for giving
Job.
way. It's frequently been referred to, I think, from both sides of the House, that Jaguar Land Rover wouldn't have been covered by the new bill and the incident which took them down. They employ a digital service provider in the form of Tata Consulting Services. And so would their digital service provider not be covered under the scope of this bill, and therefore the JLR is in the scope?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst I wouldn't rule a particular provider in or not, of course, if in this case the provider in question met the threshold for RDSP coverage, then that provider would be covered. But the locus of that coverage would be limited to the provider rather than to the end customer entity. I hope that clarifies it sufficiently. Let me, Chair, explain how Clause 8 has been designed to tackle the risks set out by honourable members in the committee. Clause 8 updates the existing duties for RDSPs in the NIS regulations, ensuring that they remain resilient against evolving cyber threats. It clarifies the requirement for these services so that it is clearer that they must secure themselves not just in order to keep the services they provide running and available, but also to contribute to wider system security as a whole. I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way again. Given the scenario that we've just discussed, it's therefore possible that the digital service provider would have an obligation to report under this new bill, but the parent company who are employing their services would not. And so, given the requirements for confidentiality which may be put upon the digital managed service provider by their parent company, their client company, how is that conflict going to be managed?
Minister.
I appreciate the question raised by the honourable member. The two things to say on this front are, one, that the relevant digital service provider in question will have a range of different customers, and my expectation would be that the regulators and indeed the NCSE would seek a deep understanding of the risk exposure across the full breadth of that portfolio rather than particularly to each customer in itself. Of course, that would form part of the sum analysis. The second thing is that on the related question that the Shadow Minister had raised about the interaction between prompt notification responsibilities and commercial confidentiality duties, I'm very happy to write about the interaction of them from the engagement we've so far conducted, especially in notification to the National Cybersecurity Centre when questions of major risks exposure are concerned. I would hope that there are provisions that allow the relevant company, the digital service provider, to do so, but I'm very happy to write to him as well as the Shadow Minister to clarify that point. Clause 8, Mr. Stringer clarifies the requirement for these services so that it is clearer that they must secure themselves, not just in order to keep the services they provide running and available, but also to contribute to wider system security as a whole. It also removes a reference to the RDSP's own network and information system to clarify that the duty is intended to cover all network and information systems that the relevant digital service relies on. The cyber risk landscape is diffuse and multifaceted. Hostile actors can use a range of routes and techniques to attempt to take services offline, but also to extort, steal, and surveil. These changes to the NIS regulations support a holistic approach to tackling cyber risk. It ensures that important dependencies are covered and that facets of security, like the confidentiality of data and integrity of systems, are not set aside. This clause also requires RDSPs to have regard to any relevant guidance issued by the Information Commission when carrying out its duties. And finally, it removes a requirement for relevant digital service providers to consider specific duties referenced in the EU regulations. I urge the committee to support this clause unamended.
Thank you. David Chadwick to reply to the debate. Well, can you inform the committee about whether you wish to push the amendment or whether you wish to withdraw it?
Can we push the amendment?
The amendment 25. Sorry, what do you wish to?
Please push it, amendment 25 for a vote, Chair.
Right. Amendment 25 to clause 28, as on the amendment paper, the question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. Division. Are the whips happy if we go straight to the vote? Yep. Right. Lock the doors.
David Chadwick.
Aye.
Andrew Cooper.
No.
Dr. Alison Gardner.
No.
Alison Griffiths.
Abstain.
Lincoln Jopp.
Abstain.
Preet Cargill.
No.
Kanishka Naran.
No.
Tyrone Watemi.
No.
Dave Robertson.
No.
Tim Rocker.
No.
Sarah Russell.
No.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Abstain.
Bradley Thomas.
Abstain.
Chris Vince.
No.
The ayes were 1, the noes 9. Therefore, the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. We now come to Amendment 28 to Clause 8, which was just debated. Does anybody wish to push Clause Amendment 28? No. We now come to the question that Clause 8 stand part of the bill, which has already been debated. The question is that Clause 8 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The government will.
I beg to move that this debate do now adjourn.
The question is that the debate be now adjourned. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it.